Football is one of the most intense and physically demanding sports, but with that comes the issue of concussions. For decades, concussions were brushed off as, just getting hit hard, and players were expected to just shake it off and get back in the game. But today, with more research and more scientific data, we know the truth. Concussions can derail careers, alter personalities, and leave a lasting mental and physical damage. So, why are concussions such a big issue? More players are, seeing their careers and lives change forever. For example, Antonio Brown, once an elite NFL wide receiver, he has exhibited bizarre behavior with many suspect is linked to repeated head trauma. So, for example, when he was with the Buccaneers, he just randomly one game in the middle of the game, just quit on the team, left the team, middle of the game. He's been known to say some very, vulgar and not normal things on social media. But for many, the effects don't end when they leave the field, sort of like I mentioned with Antonio Brown. Memory problems, depression, and even conditions like CTE have been all linked to these head injuries. So what happens during a concussion? So the immediate symptoms are headaches, dizziness, nausea, and sensitivity to light and sound. And to better understand these concussions, the NFL has implemented a computer-based neurophysiological testing to assess brain function. This technology measures players' reaction time down to the millisecond, allowing medical staff to detect even subtle deficits. So now getting into the long-term effects of concussions, two of the major ones are mental health and depression. Many former players suffer from depression, and research suggests a direct link to these concussions. The Beck Depression Inventory, or also known as BDI, is a 21-item test used to measure depression severity. Studies show that the number of concussions a player has is strongly correlated to their BDI score. But the effects are even deeper. Another study found that concussions are specifically linked to cognitive symptoms of depression, such as sadness, feelings of guilt, and self-criticism. So getting into who is most susceptible to concussions, you may think obviously a position like offensive and defensive linemen may have, some of the most higher chances of a concussion because their heads are constantly banging together at the line of scrimmage. But that's actually not the case. Studies show that cornerbacks sustain the highest proportion of concussions, while kickers suffer the least. The most common impact location is the side of the helmet, and that accounts for 39.3% of concussions. Defensive linemen are often concussed by other defensive linemen, which I thought was very interesting as well, that they were being concussed more by each other than the offensive linemen on the other team. And it can also come from linebackers on their same team as well. Furthermore, when it comes to who's the most susceptible to concussions, I was very surprised to learn that more concussions happen in practice than games, but when you think about it, it really does make sense because the sheer number of reps in practice creates way more opportunities for head impacts, because in practice you're having more game-like situations than you would really have in an actual game. The intensity of these impacts can just lead to many concussions, and the preseason is particularly dangerous. Despite only making up 20% of the season, nearly half of all concussions happen during this time. And so that just kind of goes back to what I was saying about the intensity and the number of repetitions you're getting in practice. Another interesting fact about when it comes to who's the most susceptible, in regular season games, concussions are most common late in the season. My quote for this is, in 1,216 regular season games in 5 NFL seasons, there were a total of 368 concussions, with more concussions concentrated in the last one-third of the regular season. This suggests that as the season wears on, players' bodies and brains become more vulnerable. So now moving on to NFL concussion protocol and recovery time. On average, players miss 7 to 10 days after a concussion. But the crazy part is with some of the neurophysiological studies that the NFL does, some NFL players show neurophysiological recovery in just 2 days. And the quote I have is, NFL athletes demonstrated a rapid neurophysiological recovery. As a group, NFL athletes returned to the baseline performance in a week, with the majority of athletes having normal performance 2 days after injury. This is in a major contrast to high school players who take much longer to recover, and the likely reasons for this is just brain development, and obviously high schools do not have the state of the art medical care that the NFL athletes get. And when it comes to, how fast do they all recover, there's also positional differences, like based off where they're playing on the field. So offensive linemen, tight ends, and running backs miss the most time, which I feel like definitely makes sense, as they're constantly being battered around. I can see how they would have some very severe concussions. And quarterbacks and special teams players miss the least. I mean, special teams, it makes sense. They're not on the field as much. But I was thinking maybe for quarterbacks, maybe they do have less severe concussions. But another thing to think about is, are they rushed back to playing because they're probably the most valuable player on the field. So I could definitely see, these teams kind of brushing aside some of the effects of the concussion and just trying to really get their player back on the field. So, kind of moving into what is the NFL doing to combat these concussions. They've implemented rule changes such as the targeting rule. I have a quote for this. There was a statistically significant decrease of 38% in total concussions between the 2017-2018 season and the 4 seasons between 2018-2019 and 2021 to 2022. And, these were the years that, the targeting rule was really implemented. And so clearly, it's had a pretty good drop on the number of concussions, which has been effective. So moving on to some of my primary research that I've done, here at Virginia Tech, we have a state-of-the-art helmet lab. And so I went to the helmet lab and I asked some questions, about how they do their testing and everything. So the first thing I asked was, how did VT get started with the helmet lab? And when they started, there was really kind of nothing like it. There was testing for helmets that like for lateral movements and vertical movements, but there was no rotational data, like when your head would rotate and hit the ground. There was no data for that. So they developed a lab to test that. They do all the helmet testing for college and high school athletes. So this graph was one thing that they majorly stressed to me. And when they test a helmet, the goal is to get a low score. So if you see the bottom left corner of the graph, that is like the very good range, like you're probably not going to get a concussion. And then the top right red area is where you would have a skull fracture. And so every helmet they test in here falls somewhere on this scale. And so the goal is to get a low score. When they test a helmet, they give it a score, and the score is equivalent to the estimated amount of concussions you would get in 400 head impacts. So the lower score, the better. So when I went, they showed me all different helmets, and they showed me all the top of the line helmets, and they all kind of differed, which I thought was interesting. Some of them had more of a malleable, softer outside shell, but a very tough and rigid inside shell. And then some of them had a more very rigid outside shell, but a very kind of soft and malleable inside shell. And they test these helmets using a model human head and neck that is designed to feel and weigh like a real human head. It weighs about 15 pounds, and this allows them to insert sensors into the helmet that give them data based off, the impacts and things like that, as, how it would impact a real human head. Overall, the fight for concussions is ongoing. Technology is improving, they're improving the protocols, and obviously awareness is growing with, it's clear that players are being affected by these, with players such as Antonio Brown. Overall, I think it's headed in a good direction. There's obviously still work to be done, but I think that the NFL is working, and players are, starting to realize the impacts of these concussions, and hopefully one day they won't be an issue anymore.